Good morning, students. It is, let me see, it is 5:20. Okay, it's 5:20 in the morning, and I got a different coffee mug. This is CC Jitters Coffee in a Flash. This is based on a superhero TV show, and yeah, you can probably tell which TV show, Coffee in a Flash. All right, this is the lecture that I'm doing about the Telegraph. I'm making this originally for JMS 472 in the fall of 2021, but I may use it longer than that, and I may use it in some other classes as well. Okay, let's get this thing going. First thing I want to say is that I developed this lecture several years ago, and it's not because I want everyone to know the details about the history of the telegraph. I mean, I do find that stuff interesting, but I'm using this as an example to illustrate some of the theories of technology, specifically the theories of technology that I've already mentioned and I mentioned at the beginning of the semester. So it's not that I want you to know the history of the telegraph, but I want you to think about the interaction between this communications technology and society, and also to maybe understand some of the theories of technology that we've already discussed. The way people thought about the telegraph, and the way people feared the telegraph, and the way people were excited about the telegraph, and government concerns about the telegraph are remarkably similar to the same kinds of concerns we have today about instant flow of information, the overwhelming flow of information, and the proper way to regulate, control those inventions. Let's start with some background. For much of human history, communication was equivalent to transportation. A message could only go as fast as someone could travel, or a ship could travel, or an animal could travel. That communication and transportation were basically synonymous, okay? And people for years had been dreaming, thinking, speculating about wouldn't it be great if we could communicate over long distances. The word telegraph is actually coined in 1791. It's from the Greek, and it means far writer, to write at a distance, okay? And it was actually based on a visual system of communication. These were line of sight telegraph devices. And I'll demonstrate, there was different ways to do this, but I'll demonstrate the one by this French gentleman chap. We have this tower, this big wooden tower with a series of pulleys and hinges. Now this device, someone down below, see that this image down here, someone down below in this little building could manipulate ropes and levers and make this thing make different shapes. So by making different shapes, it would indicate a particular message. The price of wheat is up, the price of wheat is down, the king is coming, the enemy is coming, bad weather is coming. And these sort of towers with this big wooden pole could be based like 20 miles apart, and someone with binoculars could see. So one person sees the symbol, they make their little tower, recreate that symbol, and then 20 miles down the road, the next person with their binoculars sees the symbol, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very cumbersome, seems really, really cumbersome, seems really, really laborious. But and it wasn't instant communication because each person had to manipulate their little tower. But a message could go from, say, Paris to the coast of France pretty quickly, far, far faster than it would take a horse to run that distance, okay? This was a visual system of communication, but the word telegraph derives from this. And there was an elaborate system developed in France in the 1790s. A lot of it was sort of government information or information for the military. Now, what I think is interesting about this is that even after we stop using this visual system of communication, we keep using the word the telegraph, okay? And this exemplifies the way when something new is invented, it's typically described it mentally and also verbally using old metaphors, okay? It's typically described using old metaphors. We talk about a web page. It's not really a page, okay? It's not really a physical page, but We sometimes talk about bookmarking a website. We're not really bookmarking it the way you would put, something in an actual book. And there's other examples that you could probably think of. But I think this kind of illustrates that. The fact that we use the word telegraph for the electric version that came later is an example of the way our mental framework is based on what came before us. Now, this individual gets most of the credit, at least in the United States, for inventing the electric version of the telegraph. And he was an artist, an entrepreneur. He had a bunch of different ideas about ways to make money. Some of them were kind of strange. One of his ideas was he would come to your house if you were rich, again, if you were rich, and he would sort of recreate the famous paintings of the Louvre Museum in miniature format, which was probably a big deal in the 1800s when, people didn't have television, or you couldn't just log on to the internet to look at these photos. Anyway, as the story goes, he claims that he's sailing from Europe back to the United States in 1832. And as the rich people did at the time, I imagine they're drinking brandy and smoking cigars and sort of the fancy first class lounge. Someone tells Morse that there are experiments going on as to how to communicate using electricity over long distances. He later claims that by the time he landed in New York, he had the fully fleshed out perfect system for the electric telegraph already worked out. That's obviously not true. We know that's not true. In New York City, he worked with a number of individuals, including people who worked at the university that later became NYU, electricians and physicists and things like this. So he worked with a number of people over the years to develop this invention. So obviously he didn't have the invention perfect in 1832. However, when a patent was finally issued for the invention, his name was the only name on the patent. There were a number of people experimenting with sending messages over electricity, as I said. The big innovation that made Morse's invention work was the development of something called Morse code. And Morse code, essentially, you take the alphabet and you break it down into dots and dashes, okay? And E over here, we have the letter E. The letter E is the most common letter in the English language. E is the simplest thing to transmit, which is a simple dot. And then you have, where's S? S is 3 dots, okay? There's, you have an individual at one end, an individual at the other end. A burst of electricity is sent through the wire. At first, the idea was that there'd be ink put on paper, and then user innovation, people realized that just from the sound of the thing coming through, the sound, you could tell with enough training, is that a dot or is that a dash? So the paper went away and it just became this, the traditional Morse code that maybe you're familiar with. Samuel Morse gets credit for inventing this code. He didn't really invent it. His original idea was to take the most common words in the English language, or the most common phrases, and convert them to numbers. So 213 might mean gold is up. 416 might mean bad weather is coming, something like that. An individual working for Morse, a guy named Alfred Vail, came up with the idea that you could just do away with that code system and convert the alphabet itself to dots and dashes. So you did not need that elaborate numerical code. However, Morse, his name is the only name that's on the invention. So only geeks like me, remember Alfred Vail. But Samuel Morse didn't actually invent Morse code. And then at the bottom here, this legend explains there were certain phrases. Have you anything for me? I'm busy. A dollar mark, something like that. Samuel Morse and Vail are experimenting. They do a number of transmissions early in 1844. The most famous one is this one here. I want to read from my notes a little bit here. Yeah. The most famous one is this one. What hath God wrought? Okay, it is a quote from the Bible. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. It's sent by Morse from the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. to his partner Vail in Baltimore. And this was not the first transmission. This was the first one that was really publicized in the newspapers. Okay, so we have this mystique of the magic moment going on. Sometimes this is reported as the very first message over the telegraph. That was not true. This was the first one that was publicized. Now, Morse wanted to sell the invention to the government. Samuel Morse wanted the government, the US government, to take over the electric telegraph. And there's a quote. The quote is something like, the use of an instrument with such potential for good or evil is far too powerful to be left to individuals and must be controlled by the government. What Morse is saying, as the statement says, this invention has so much capability that we can't let private interests control it, because private individuals are going to be corrupt and use it for nefarious purposes, that it needs to be controlled by the government. However, the US government, the sprinklers just came on outside. The US government decided not to fund the invention. I think they maybe didn't believe it. They thought it was something like, paranormal activity. Like, people have been talking about long distance communication for a long time. They just didn't believe it. The US government had also lost a lot of money investing in canals recently, and they said, we don't want to develop this infrastructure. Had the US government taken over the telegraph in the 1840s, I think the entire history of communications in the United States would be different. Okay, had the government made the choice that we're going to take over this and fund this and nationalize this, it would have developed much, much differently. And all later forms of electronic communication probably would have developed differently in the United States. So this is a pivotal moment in the development of communications technologies. And back to the Bible quote. The Bible quote illustrates this sort of utopian hopes people had for new communications technology. People always think the newest thing is going to solve everything, make education better. People thought it was just going to be great. We're going to bring the world together. There's even a quote like, how can the world fight wars once we can communicate with one another? But there were people who were fearful of the technology. Once it developed and became very popular, there was concerns about information overload and overloading people's nervous system with information, and that this is really not a great thing at all. And also a quote from Thoreau, guy who wrote On Walden Pond, said something to the effect of, so maybe we can communicate with the Queen of England. Big deal. What is the Queen going to tell us? What do we need to know from the Queen anyway? So anyway, know there's a lot of information, but know that this was not the very first transmission, but it was the first one that was publicized. That's what I want you to know. The 1850s was a period of rapid growth, particularly in the United States. Okay, the United States is a very, very large country, and we didn't have a lot of infrastructure already. So railroads and the telegraph developed very, very quickly. United States probably put more telegraph lines down than anyone else. French resisted. Remember that visual system of communication? This is an example of momentum. Okay, when you start doing something, even after conditions change, you maybe still do it the same way. And the French were like, ha, 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 we don't need the telegraph. They thought they had their own telegraph, right? Which was cumbersome and expensive and wasn't nearly as fast as an electric telegraph. But they had their own system and actually resisted. And this is another lecture. France had something called Minitel, which was a precursor to the internet that worked off telephone lines. I believe this was big in the 1980s. So when the internet actually did come to France, France did the same thing. They resisted. They said, we have our own version of the internet called Minitel, which was simplified, wasn't full internet. So that's history repeating itself, where when some infrastructure comes in place, you want to keep it even when it's no longer the best in the world. In Russia, the Tsar actually tried to slow down the growth of the telegraph because he feared radical groups would use it to overthrow him. This is an example of technology being suppressed. Now, in the United States, there was a company called Western Union. Hold on, what are my notes here? Western Union. Western Union controlled most of the telegraph lines Here you have some statistics. You don't need to worry about the numbers, just get the gist of it. 77% of the miles of wire were controlled by Western Union. This is in the United States, one company with a monopoly. But look, 92% of newspaper messages, of press messages, were controlled by Western Union. And the money coming from the telegraph industry, almost 90% of it, is going to one company. Today, there's concerns about Google and Facebook and other companies having a control over the flow of information. People were concerned about the same thing over 100 years ago. People were concerned about the same thing over 100 years ago, and government tried to regulate it and suppress it. One of the things that Western Union did was they told everyone in Congress they could have free use of the telegraph whenever they wanted it. And that made some Congress people, less inclined to break up this monopoly. And the government never did break up the monopoly of Western Union. It eventually lost its power because of the rise of other communications technologies. And closely aligned with Western Union, we have the Associated Press. You should know about this. There was a war going on with Mexico. A bunch of newspapers in New York were all using the telegraph to get messages from Mexico. And there was not a lot of telegraphs, so reporters even had to take turns. And there's legends about some reporters just sitting on the telegraph and sending Bible verses just to take up time so the person behind them couldn't get the use of their telegraph. Anyway, that might be apocryphal, but basically 7 newspapers come together and they decide to pool their information so that the information sent through the Associated Press, as it's called, could be used by anybody that's in the organization, so that the newspapers could share the information, reduce the cost of telegraph messages, and kind of work together. The government actually, again, like with Western Union, the government tried to break up the power of Associated Press, because you can imagine if you weren't in the clique, if you weren't in this little club and you didn't get the information, you're at a competitive disadvantage. But again, the government never broke up the Associated Press, and now the organization still exists and still functions in a similar way. This relates specifically to the Carey reading, okay? There's 4 points, or what I think are 4 main points from that reading. And it does also talk about utopian hopes and fears and things like that. What is the effect of the telegraph? There's an increase in transportation efficiency, because as I've already mentioned, telegraphs and railroads develop simultaneously, and you can operate your railroad more effectively if you have long distance forms of communication. We have a standardization of time zones, which we may not think about today, but time zones used to vary. Noon in one city is not noon exactly in the next city. The sun is not in the same place, but railroads can't function if there's, a million different time zones. So the spread of communication, the coordination of long distance people over long distance led to the standardization of time zones. We also have the decline in regional markets. If the price of corn or the price of some crop varies from region to region, you could make money by buying in one area and selling in the other. Well, when the telegraph comes about, now information can be spread very, very quickly, and it's used by banks, right? Economic information is very, very important on the telegraph. So and this is what Carey spends most of the reading talking about. There's a decline in these regional markets, but a rise of the futures markets, which can be a little confusing, and this is not an econ class. But essentially, sellers can lock in a certain price in the future, and buyers can lock in a certain price in the future based on what they think is coming. We know we're going to be buying some corn in the future, and the seller wants to set a price a certain way, and the buyer wants to sell a price a certain way. And a lot of this buying and selling and trading in the futures markets, the products never actually move. The products are all sitting in one place. People are just buying contracts and agreements with one another. Anyway, according to Carey, the telegraph really, really encouraged this. Didn't cause it. Pay attention to that in the reading. Carey does not say the Telegraph is the sole cause, that the economics and markets and business had already been moving in this direction. The Telegraph just really solidified it. And now you get people buying and selling and never actually moving the goods. And sort of the speculative market moves further and further away from physical goods and actual reality. There's a different mentality. People begin to think about the world differently because of the Telegraph. Or people were beginning to think about the world differently, and the Telegraph encourages it. Okay, I don't want to fall into determinism. I don't want to fall into determinism to say the Telegraph was the sole cause of this, but it definitely was a factor. There is an ongoing debate about the effect of the Telegraph on the nature of U.S. journalism. The drawing right here is from Harper's Weekly. It is from the Civil War. It shows a mobile telegraph station being operated during the Civil War. These guys could drag cable. There's a big spool of cable. They could take it to the front lines, transmit it back so that some general or someone way in the back could get the information. And I think it's pretty amazing that they were using these mobile telegraph stations during the Civil War. Anyway, there's an argument that the Telegraph led to a decline of editorial commentary and the rise of just the facts. When information moved slowly across long distances, different publications, different newspapers had regional writing styles because they were only appealing to the readers in one particular section. And news took so long to get to you, you had to fill up your paper with a lot of opinions and a lot of editorial commentary. But now, once information can be spread instantly through things like the Associated Press, now we start to get the idea that news is what happened immediately, not what happened last week or what last month. That news is what happens immediately, and you can get information from all over the world. There even was a transatlantic cable, a cable that literally connected London to New York. Think about that. They put down a cable to collect London to New York in the 1860s. Kind of amazing. It's the equivalent of putting a man on the moon. Anyway, there's this argument that, yeah, the Telegraph changed the nature of U.S. journalism by bringing up the fact that news is something that happened immediately and we need less commentary. There's also the argument that the Telegraph led to the creation of the inverted pyramid writing style. The inverted pyramid writing style, I'll just go to the next slide. With the inverted pyramid, which is still taught in journalism classes, you put the most important information first, and then you put, as the article goes on, you put items of diminishing importance. You do not tell the story in chronological order. You do not say, a man came home, he made himself some dinner, thought he smelled smoke, wasn't sure if he smelled smoke. Then he goes upstairs, fire breaks out, he and his wife are killed, the son is saved. No, that's not the way you tell a story. It's something like, fire at such and such address killed 2 individuals, 1 child survived. Something like that. Now, the reason for doing that is ease for the reader. A reader can skim and get the information very quickly. But there was also a very practical reason for doing that back in the older era of newspapers. If an editor said, I want 7 column inches, you knew that the 7th inch or the 6th and 7th inch would be the least important facts. And literally 7 column inches means I want 7 inches, because that's how much space we have in the newspaper. The ad is taking up this much space. We've got 7 inches left. Suddenly Macy's decides they want a bigger ad. Okay, now we need to cut off 2 inches. It makes editing a lot easier if you could just cut off the bottom rather than having to go in and rewrite the whole thing. Anyway, the legend for many years was that telegraph lines during the Civil War were rather unreliable. And when reporters got access to a telegraph, they had to send their information first. That's not true. We now know that's not true. The inverted pyramid writing style didn't become standard in U.S. journalism for decades after the Civil War. So that Civil War story is not true. However, there is a connection between the Civil War and the inverted pyramid writing style. because a lot of information was censored and controlled. And scholars have said when you put something into the inverted pyramid writing style and make it appear more bland and authoritarian, you can actually manipulate information better. You can actually alter the facts, but when you present it in this manner, it seems more authoritarian. So there is some connection between the Civil War and the censorship and control of information and the inverted pyramid writing style, but it is not that argument that the telegraph lines were unreliable. And I'm going to end right here. This is a newspaper image of the transatlantic cable, and I just want to say that you think life is hard now, you think parking on campus is difficult now. People in the 1860s, literally using a ship, put a telegraph from England, well, actually from Ireland, but okay, it's this big area, all the way over to North America. They hit up in Newfoundland, and then telegraph cables went down to New York. They literally did a physical connection between the two continents. That still blows my mind. So you think life is hard now? Life is not hard. You think you did something tough? You didn't do this. Anyway, I've gone on long enough. Hopefully that puts some things in context. All right. And I'm going to have more coffee.